So that should be my cue to introduce our speaker today. I want to say welcome to all of you here in the room and those of you who are joining us online for the Asia Center's first Global Asia lecture of the semester. I want to point out to you to keep your eyes open for 3 more this fall by Professors Christy Kang and Idi Abram, both of ASU, and Ashley Thompson from the University of London, SOAS. And so those we will be making announcements in the coming weeks. So please keep an eye open. But today it's my distinct pleasure to introduce to you Professor Douglas Guthrie, a sociologist of modern China and expert in international business and trade, technology and society, entrepreneurship, and organizational development. He spent his career researching, writing, and teaching, advising companies on organizational development in Chinese economic reforms. A fluent speaker of Mandarin and other Chinese dialects, he earned his undergraduate degree in Chinese literature at the University of Chicago and his doctorate in organizational sociology at UC Berkeley. Before joining Thunderbird, sometime during COVID, he was the director of Apple University in Shanghai, and previously was dean of George Washington School of Business, held faculty and administrative positions at NYU Stern School of Business, and directed a program at the Social Science Research Council. I don't mean to make you uncomfortable, but thank you so much for joining us today. It is such a pleasure to have you here, and in particular to have you speak on your new project, which I thought was tentatively entitled 2035, which is such a promising number. And so today's talk is on doing business in today's China, unpacking Xi Jinping's era, and offering a preview of your forthcoming book. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, everybody. It's so exciting to actually be a part of the Asia Studies community here at ASU. And just to be a part of what we all do here. I felt honored and lucky to come join Thunderbird during the COVID, and but it's also just such an honor and great fortune to be a part of ASU, because not only is this just such an exciting place and an exciting time for ASU, I've said this to some of you, but I have deep history with this place. I used to spend my summers in Scottsdale, Arizona in the 1970s because my grandfather was the number 6 faculty member hired at the School of Education. And so in 1956, I think. And so I have a long history, and it just feels like I came home. Like finally, after a long and winding career, here I am. But a big part of what I do is, as is mentioned, is China and China studies and Asia. And so Thunderbird is an amazing place for me to do my work on global leadership and doing business in the global economy. But I grew up as a language and literature person at the University of Chicago. Listening to, it's Lawrence, right? I was listening to Lawrence talk about doing language study, and it was taking me back to my sophomore year when I started studying Chinese at the University of Chicago. So couple of quick things. We are doing some filming and things, and we have some people online. I tend to be a speaker who is a wanderer. And so if I look like my feet are glued to the carpet, it's because what I really want to do is be out here like talking to you and listening to questions, but we're trying to film. And the second thing is, when I give talks, I love to be interrupted. And what I mean by that is I want to have a dialogue, and I have lots of slides. And if you want to just sit back and listen and go to sleep, that's okay too. But if you're thinking for a second, like, I disagree with that, or I have a question about that, do not think twice. Just jump in and like, we're ready. The final thing I'll say by way of introduction is I can't believe I'm giving this talk today. So yes, this is part of my next big project, and 2035, for those of you who don't know, is a big important year at of the meetings last March. They announced that 2035 is, that says that by 10 years from now, we are going to be in the dominant position as the global economy of the world. And my collaborators and I believe it. And I can talk a little bit more about my experience and my identity as a China bull. I have long been one. When I was in China for Apple, China also broke my heart a little bit. And so there's interesting personal dynamics there too, but this is the time. And so just giving this talk today, when Huawei was in the news during the secretary's visit, and then Apple's in the news because of losing $200 billion in valuation. These are the two companies that I know more about than any other companies that I've advised. And so it was just feeling like, oh my God, this is the moment. This is the moment to talk about China. Oh, I have to today about China. So it's wonderful and exciting. Again, if we kind of go off in different directions, I'm fine with it. Okay. So very quickly, I'll do some introductory things. What's happening here? Just to give a little bit more background about myself, I have a strong identity as a boots on the ground person, which, as we were discussing before the talk, it was really painful, the pandemic, for me, because my entire intellectual identity, my identity as a scholar is like, yeah, I was trained in economic sociology. I know how to read lots of statistics and governmental statistics. But what I really identify with is as a person who goes out and talks to people. So the research that I did, the first major project I did was getting on my flying pigeon bicycle and riding out to factories. And I studied 81 factories in Shanghai in the chemicals, foods, electronics, and textile sectors, and garments. And, just tried to really kind of get a deep sense of what was happening. And so that's been my identity for so long, and have lived in and out of China in my adult life. And then suddenly, I came back from China in December of 2019, and I didn't know it would be 4 years before I could get back there again. So anyway, if you hear tension or you hear me start to tear up, it's because of that identity. But then later in life, I started to develop connections with a bunch of other companies, and probably the companies that I have the two biggest connections with are these two. And so they are the two that have been in the news, and it's just, it's amazing to really think about what's happening today. And again, we can go in any direction you want to in the talk, but hearing what's happening in China today and sort of the gauntlet being thrown down right now, I think it's a fascinating moment. It's just amazing. And so I want to make sure we can hear all the voices. And then I've just worked with lots of different companies in terms of advisory work, but also in case study development. And so that's been my identity, and that's who I am. I tend to be, if you sort of look at the back end of my career, I really look like a business school person, right? I'm at Thunderbird. Before that, I was at Apple. And before that, I was at GW and at Stern. But my heart and soul is really as a language and literature person. And it's just because that's how I fell in love with China. That's how I fell in love with the language. When I was a freshman at the University of Chicago and feeling fortunate that I was there, I was like, I'm going to study economics. I mean, this is the 1980s, right? You study economics and you go work for McKinsey, right? And then my roommate dared me when you have a language requirement in Chicago, and I was signing up for my sophomore classes, and he dared me to take Chinese. I'm like, all right, whatever, I'll just do it. And I didn't know that I was going to fall in love with the language. And there were personal reasons why that happened. But the next thing I knew, I took a leave of absence from school, went to live in Taiwan, and the rest was history, if you will. But the point I like to make is I believe in the language, literature, and history. I'm very passionate about it. But when I study economics, and in particular when I'm advising businesses, this is really important to me. You don't get to be successful doing business in China without thinking deeply about the history and culture. You just don't. Like, it's just too important. And, to some extent, what we're witnessing right now in the last decade with Xi Jinping is really to me, as a language and literature person who studied, Emperor Yongle in 1424 and China's inward turn, like, this is what I see in Xi Jinping, right? And so, like, helping people understand that, I'm a big believer in history and culture and sort of the whole Asia studies movement in thinking about business. I also am a big political economy person. It drives me crazy when we talk about China just as this, big nation, the most populous nation in the world, 1.4 billion people, and we just need to understand what Beijing's doing. If you spend any time doing research or advising companies in China, you have to appreciate just how diverse this place is. So you got 31 provincial level units, and then you got municipalities and townships and villages. But my own research and my collaborators and I write about this a lot. I borrow heavily from Andy Walters, one of my favorite China scholars in the world, just so you know. Andy Walter, huge inspiration for me. And 1994, he wrote this beautiful article in the American Journal of Sociology that was called Local Governments as Industrial Firms. And he was sort of the first one, in my opinion, to really crack open this idea, like, yeah, you want to understand what China's doing, 14 5-year plan, fine. Or whichever 5-year plan, great. But what you have to understand is that all of the people in the provincial and more importantly, the municipal areas are incentivized just like people who are VPs of a corporate division. And so, they have, if you want to do well in China, you have to be thinking about locals, right? And so that's a big part of my work. And then just also watching China as the most powerful manufacturing hub in the world, but also as a geopolitical superpower. And this is a big part of Xi Jinping's agenda as well. Okay, I'm not gonna waste time on this, but this is my favorite entry point into how do we think about China. Anybody guess what year this is? Anybody?
95.
It's you. What's your name?
Jonathan.
Jonathan, okay. 1994, this was the year I moved to Shanghai for the first time. And I was looking out over the Bund and I was just like, okay, wow. And then, of course, when I left China, the most recent time, that same picture looked like this, right? And to me, it's an amazing sort of magical economic development story that has lots of pieces to it, lots of population, lots of manufacturing, but it's really sort of an amazing story. And the thing I think we often forget, and this often frustrates me when whether it's talking to politicians and pundits or it's talking to people in the corporate sector, there's also a lot going on here. And so, like, I get calls often when people are like, well, Foxconn just built a factory in India. It's over, right? Like, no. There is 40 years of infrastructure being built here. And Apple, just so you know, they're married to China. There is yes, Foxconn can be in India, it's final assembly, but Apple relies on 1,600 suppliers in China. And having a final assembly plant in India doesn't mean anything. And so, but having this infrastructure and all of the things that go on in the technological development that has built the world's most powerful manufacturing supply chain is part of China 2035, but it's also just part of the story of how you get here. And if India wants to go there, wonderful. It's amazing. If the Belt and Road Initiative wants to take Africa there, wonderful. But it takes decades to do this. And so that's really, I think, one of the interesting stories that I've had the fortune of being a part of. So very quickly, before we get to today, I always like to start here because, Deng Xiaoping coming to power, surprising everybody. I love the leadership story, Lena. Maybe you've heard me talk about this story, but when I'm teaching leadership and talking about great leadership moments, I often like to remind people leadership isn't just about the Tim Cooks or the Deng Xiaopings as leaders of the world. Leadership is about everyone every day kind of making a decision. Everyday leadership, we call it. And so I love the story of Deng Xiaoping because when he was 16 years old, he was trying to save up money and he borrowed money from his dad. He was going to go steerage to France. And his father said, why would you want to go to France? Like, we're China. Almost Zhongguoren, right? And he said, I want to go to the West and learn what I can and come back and save China. Okay. And that's what he did, right? 60 years later. And it's kind of an amazing story. And then he opened the world after that visit with Jimmy Carter, he went to Atlanta to figure out Coca-Cola. He went to Seattle to figure out complex manufacturing. Coke and Boeing were the first two companies to sign the new joint venture contracts under that were passed in January of 1979. And then, we've just seen so much development since then. Tesla's later than this whole story, but yeah, I mean, it's just been an amazing thing. And we're going to talk a little bit about Apple today because it's going to be my case study. It's the case study that I know the best, but Apple enters China in 2001, right? And from there, it has just been, China is the reason that Apple is the most valuable company in the world, period. There is no, yes, their phones are beautiful, their products are beautiful, but it is because of how Tim Cook set up the supply chain and how he forced Chinese suppliers to compete against each other. But there's an interesting part of that story that I was very fortunate for my own research and for this talk, doing business in the era of Xi Jinping, to be a part of. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more detail about what that meant. Okay, so, and then of course, 30 years later, after Deng Xiaoping goes to visit Jimmy Carter, we have the greatest coming out party in, I mean, for those of you who remember this, it's a great story. And so, how did we get here? Well, we don't have to walk through this whole period, but we want to go through this because this talk is about doing business in the era of Xi Jinping. And there is a long, interesting trajectory here, right? There's Deng Xiaoping in the 80s and basically just trying to incentivize people and give people the opportunity to become entrepreneurs, right? In the Cultural Revolution, people might be shot in town square for being the capitalist entrepreneur. And so Deng Xiaoping had to really bring people back to that. And then you have the 90s, which is a fascinating era of, sometimes Chinese people get mad because I have Zhu Rongji instead of Jiang Zemin there, but Zhu Rongji is my favorite reformer of the reform era. I think he's the most important player. And what he did during the 90s was amazing. And then you have Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao. And of course, as I'm sure all of you know who study the economy, the critical moment that changed everything was China's entry into the WTO in 2001, right? And why did that change everything? Because it eliminated the ability to have a quid pro quo for market access, right? And that's an important part of the story over what I call the return to the 1990s style of control within the WTO regime, right? And Xi Jinping has been brilliant at doing that, right? And so we have this arc. We're not going to talk about much of those today, but we are going to talk about this one. Because this is about doing business in the era of Xi Jinping, right? And what does this mean? Well, first of all, we do know, and we've been at this a decade now, right? Xi Jinping comes to power in March of 2013. So here we are in 2023. And, I'm not the first to say this. There's been many people who have written about this, but this is, this has been the most aggressive consolidation of power since Mao, for sure, and maybe even more so. And that's a little bit, let me take that back, like maybe not, because what it was remarkable and crazy, but like the way that Xi Jinping has done it, I think is truly, it's been remarkable, but it's been done in this era of the WTO regime. We've seen this consolidation of power in a number of explicit ways, right? We've seen things like a much more aggressive kind of control of the People's Congress. But we've also seen the rise of China as a commercial superpower. And so Xi Jinping has had to do this balance, right? He's had to figure out, how do I get better control, but how do I keep growth rates? Now, one of the things that frustrates me sometimes when we read or talk with us, doing an interview not too long ago, and the reporter was like, but, isn't it a mess? This is like a couple of weeks ago when everybody was talking about like, oh my God, China is not going to hit 5.5%. It's a disaster. And this reporter was saying, well, but I think we've gotten used to double-digit growth rates, right? And I was like, yeah. And you need to get unused to it, like double-digit growth. Like just think about basic math. The larger the denominator gets, the more, like this is basic stuff. And so, but I think China has been remarkable at how the government has continued to control the economy. And yes, we have COVID and we have a lot of geopolitical issues that have been really central to how it is that China is going to navigate the system. But I think we're going to continue to see growth. And, again, my collaborators and I really firmly believe this idea that China will be the largest economy in the world by 2035, probably 2 years earlier. And it will have consolidated its position as a broker of geopolitical deals, right? And so that's why this year was so interesting and important, is because you have the aftermath of the COVID downturn. You have sort of returning to good, okay growth rates. But then you have Xi Jinping brokering the deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Like, wow. Okay, and then the reorganization of BRICS. Wow. Okay, like, all of this is happening while we're continuing to go gangbusters, which again, related to what we're seeing in the last 2 days or last 5 days, I think it's fascinating. And I want to talk more about that because I want to hear your thoughts, but it is fascinating. Our own government disallowed government officials to use Huawei phones probably 10 years ago, right? So this has been in the making, but the fact that Huawei has an announcement of the release of the Mate 60, which caught the technology world by surprise when Raimondo was there. Okay. And then there's this announcement that is sort of a quid pro quo for what the US did to Huawei phones, but now they're doing to Apple phones, and suddenly. So anyway, exciting times. I'm trying to scroll, I'm getting chills. But how are we doing? Okay, I'm going to keep talking fast, but I want to make sure that we understand that this is about the China dream, right? And so when I talk about history and I talk about, what Xi Jinping thinks, like, for those who know China well, and you talk to people in China, people who know history will talk about this idea, like, yeah, we're not just a country of cheap manufacturing. We, for 1,000 years, were the most innovative economy in the world. Paper, silk. We often think of Gutenberg when we think of the printing press. No, printing press originated in China. The nautical compass, gunpowder, right? And so when you start to think about what is Xi Jinping's China dream, this is really about China retaking its position as the most powerful nation on earth. We don't need to go through all, but this is Emperor Yongle, King Henry V. They had very different inaugurations during this time. But there is also, if you think about this from the history of, China's control of the world, when Columbus set sail in 1492, 3 ships, 90 sailors. When Admiral Zheng He used to routinely set sail to explore the South China Seas, about 400 ships, about 28,000 crew members, maritime technology that Europe wouldn't see for about 300 years, right? And so this is the China dream. And again, this is why I think history is important, because when you talk to people in this space, they'll tell you, like, this Xi Jinping China dream isn't just about China continuing to 2035 to be the most powerful economy in the world. This is about China retaking its position. So I forget who was we were talking before the meeting started about the G20. China's not going to the G20, right? China hates the G20. They think it is so disrespectful. Right now, people in the West might say, well, you can't be a member of the G7 because the G7 was capitalist democracies. That was the origin of the idea. Well, we know that was thrown out because we let Russia in 2008, right? And then, of course, Russia was out with the invasion of Crimea. But people in China think about this. They're like, nah, like, we're not going to the kids' table anymore. We got the BRICS. We're reorganizing the BRICS. We're going to be fine. Right. And so when we worry about, like, they're going to the G20 and what that means, it means, sorry, guys, we're done. We're done. Until you invite us to the parents' table, we're doing our own thing. And so that's, again, part of the China dream. Now, of course, the advantages here, and I'm going to go through this really quickly because I want to get to the case study. But there is the floating population and a massive labor force, which is very powerful. There's the technical vocational labor force, and we often forget, like, this is a highly trained labor force. And I gained the most appreciated for that when I was working at Apple. Because, you know, if you go to Apple suppliers, yes, they rely heavily on the floating population, but really there's a very, very, very sophisticated group of vocational laborers that are trained by the Chinese government. And you know, and so again, like when you think about like, oh, Foxconn's moving to India, it's fine. No, this is a complicated story that has been 40 years in the making. And so massive investment in infrastructure. And it also is an advantage for China that China is a one-party authoritarian system. Because if Apple's supplier here needs to get to Foxconn Zhengzhou and there's a village in the way, you know, and I'm not arguing that that's a good thing or advocating for it, but like that's a big difference with India, right? And so just thinking about like what the advantages are here is important. My other favorite story of this will get us into the Apple discussion. China controls about somewhere between 70 and 90% of the mining and refinement of rare earths in the world, right? And so, you know, some people may remember that there was a dust up between China and Japan, and it was like 2010, maybe 2012, I can't remember the exact date. But there was a Chinese fisherman who was held captive by the Japanese, you know, whatever. It was a messy situation. And the fascinating thing about this situation, and you know, there were people in Apple that were like, why are you telling us this story? Because when, you know, this is the Belt and Road Initiative stuff, but when we see, oh, got messed up with my story. Anyway, I'll get back to the story that's interesting is suddenly this little company called Sony no longer had access to neodymium. Now, being a China scholar, I have no idea what neodymium is. But neodymium is apparently crucial for the magnets that go inside of earphones. And if Sony can't get access to neodymium, we're in trouble, right? And when I started telling that story, the Apple leadership was like, okay, say that again. Our AirPods use neodymium. Like, and I'm like, okay, like, let's just pay attention. And that just gets us into this conversation about what is it that Xi Jinping has done to be able to control this economy so effectively in the WTO regime. So remember, you can't have a quid pro quo for market access. You can't tell companies, you do this and then you'll get access to this. Right? And so Apple executives felt fine. They were like, we're awesome because we came into China in 2001, post WTO accession. We're good. They can't tell us to do anything. So we see Xi Jinping come to power and we have the anti-corruption campaign. But the key thing that is so important in the Xi Jinping regime has been this transition. China worked hard to build a legal infrastructure that would mirror capitalist democratic systems, right? So like companies like Apple would feel good doing business here, right? And if you sat across the table doing joint venture negotiations, you know, having arbitration clauses and joint country and having third country arbitration, it's all really important stuff, right? It's all rule of law stuff. But China has a long history of what we would call rule by law. And when I say long history, you know, this dates back maybe 2,000 years. If you read Han Fei, I mean, this was the origin of the notion of rule by law, which is that we need laws, but laws allow powerful authoritarian dictators, be they emperors or the president of China in 2013, to force people to do what they want them to do, right? So it's not about an independent adjudication through a judiciary system. It's just about forcing organizations to do what you want them to do. And so this gets me into the Apple case. So I left my deanship in 2013, 14. And I was trying to figure out what I was going to do next. And I was very fortunate to get a call from Joel Podolny, who was the head of Apple University, and you know, put me in touch with Tim Cook. And it was basic, I was flattered, like I was excited. Okay, let me go back to China. And, Apple, even though it on paper isn't the largest foreign investor in China in the world in terms of spend, bigger than any other country in the world by a lot. And it was doing well, right? Now, for those in the room who were, as I do, were watching Chinese politics, you may remember this time, but we were all thinking Wu Xilai was going to be the heir apparent to Hu Jintao. And, it felt like, okay, there's going to be a more authoritarian leader here, because the period under Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao post WTO session was just like, if you were advising companies during that time as I was, it just felt like the doors are open, guys. It's awesome. We can do it. And that's the time when Apple went in, right? And so when they called me, I had a little time to watch and to think about this. And Xi Jinping was already making me nervous. I was worried. I was sort of worried just where things were going to go. But we didn't know. And now Apple should have had the first signal, the first shot across the bow. So since the early 1980s, when Deng Xiaoping wanted to assure Chinese citizens that just because we're going down this economic opening thing, GDP high fund, we're capitalism, we still want to protect Chinese people, right? So every year, starting in probably the early 1990s, they started having something on March 15th, the Ides of March. Every year they have what's called Consumer Day. And they call out one company, right? And that one company just like gets the stuffing beat out of them for the next bit, right? Xi Jinping was inaugurated on March 14th, 2013. March 15th, 2013 was Consumer Day. And guess who was called out? Apple. Now, so I'm starting to talk to them a little bit after this, but at the time they were just sort of like, it's fine. It's fine. Like we paid a $10 million fine for some tax issues, but everybody knows we're sorry that people thought we were treating Chinese consumers differently with our warranty practices. It's fine. And at the time, again, I was sort of trying to figure out what I was going to do next, but I was fascinated because I was like, it's not fine. Like this is going to be the most amazing case study I've ever been able to ethnographically be a part of. Which later I would learn that, NDA agreements and things can get you in trouble. But I was just like, yes, let me come and help you guys. And, in the early stages, as we were watching what was happening, again, I was starting to get really nervous because we had changes that were a part of this rule by law system, right? So first, dispatch labor reform, 2013, right? And this was one where, so for those who don't know what this is, basically dispatch labor is the thing that controls the floating population, right? So you have 400 million people, 300 million people that float around the country, and they're part of the floating population, and they're controlled by the state, right? And it's an amazing system because it allows for seasonal production. So if you're Apple or any of Apple's suppliers, there's 2 spikes on the calendar in production, right? iPhones are launched in September. And so like July through August, July and the end of August, you need about 5 times as many workers. But if Foxconn has to pay those workers labor contract wages for the year round, economically, the thing falls apart. But if, as is the case with all of Apple's suppliers, you have a spike and you're employing about 5 times as many people in that 2-month period, but then they just get moved on by the government to another system, you're good, right? It's great. Now, the labor dispatch system came out and it said any company at any given point in time is only allowed to have 10% of its laborers as labor dispatch. Everybody else has to be under the labor contract, right? And so, the next thing I know, I'm the best friends with lawyers in Cupertino, and they're asking me like, how are we supposed to comply with this? Like the system's falling apart. What do we do? India? Like Vietnam? We can't do Vietnam, it's too small. Like, what do we do? And I remember these conversations so clearly because I was like, that's the point. You're supposed to be out of compliance. Now you can imagine like the head exploding of this person who was trained at Harvard Law School, and they're like, you know, grew up advising Apple. And what do you mean we're supposed to be out of compliance? Like, because if you're out of compliance, you or Rory Sexton or somebody who works for ops is going to go visit the mayor of Zhengzhou and figure out what he wants. Right? And then he didn't ask you, so it's not a quid pro quo for market access. It doesn't violate any WTO rules, but you started delivering for them everything that they wanted. And at the time, people at Apple were like, nah, you're crazy, you're crazy. And I was sort of lucky because some of the things I predicted happened. So they passed another law, the cybersecurity law. And the next thing you know, the iTunes store was shut down. And then things started to get really crazy. And so this was the greatest moment for me in my time with Apple, because I was like, it's going to get worse, guys. And, you know, as a consultant, you never want to be a doomsayer, because like, I'll just go hire somebody else unless you're really right about something. And so I was ringing my alarm bell. And in 2015, SASC, what's away? The State-Owned Asset Supervision and Administration Commission, which is one of the most powerful organizations in Chinese economy, and the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences did a study. And the study was basically about who's good and who's bad. And it was a corporate social responsibility study. And so everybody inside of Apple at the time was like, we're great. You know, the whole thing is leave the world better than you found it. We're awesome. We do everything with environmental stuff. We're great. I was like, I don't think so. I think you're not great because you don't have the right organizational structure. And they're like, don't worry, Mr. Professor Doug, it's going to be fine. And they were stunned when it came out that they were one of the worst rated foreign investment companies in China in all of their peer group. So Intel was in the 80s, Samsung was in the 80s, Apple was in the 20s on this 1 to 100 ranking scale. And one of the things that's really interesting here is notice that every one of these companies, with the exception of the Jituan Gongsi, all have China, which means they're all Chinese joint ventures. Only Pingguo Gongsi, 什么意思? Well, Pingguo Gongsi just means they don't have any joint ventures, right? And that's their economic model. But this made Xi Jinping really mad, right? And of course, you can't change it because of the WTO and no quid pro quo for market access, but they had to send the signal somewhere, right? And as we went deeper in this with the team, sorry, this is where my story got out of order. Sorry, I already told the story. But again, this was the big question is, what does this mean? And so this is where it gets really important for doing business under Xi Jinping is they're not allowed by WTO rules to tell you what to do. They just have to have an open marketplace, but they can make your life very, very difficult. And so when I would try to explain this to Apple executives, this is where all of Apple's stuff was. But one thing for those, again, who read Chinese, this is Apple's main business in China. It's the headquarters, 151. But look at this, Maui Gongsi. When you say Maui Gongsi, when you say trading company in Chinese, it reminds people of the Dutch East India Trading Company, which are what the Opium War was fought over, right? Like Maui Gongsi 就是有点不好听, right? It just sounds horrible. And so that was the main representative to the government. And so what we had to do was we had to help Apple figure out how to show up differently and how to really kind of become a different kind of organization. Now, Apple wasn't about to build joint ventures, and it wasn't about to follow. So many players in this space in this time period got the message. They got the memo. You saw HP and their joint venture with Guthrie University. You saw Dell, their very public investment. You saw Microsoft. You saw IBM, Qualcomm. And Apple was still sitting on the sidelines, right? And then things just got worse and worse and worse. And finally, the next thing you know is that you have Li Keqiang in Davos talking about how important technology transfer is and how important they want partnership with everybody. And this is finally when the memo came out, when it became clear that Apple could no longer be headed towards being the most profitable and valuable company in the world if they didn't play ball with Xi Jinping. That's when the memo came through. And so the next thing you know, they wanted to avoid joint ventures, but they had to start telling stories about tacit knowledge. And it was a powerful story. There was a lot of changes in the operations team because basically you just had ops engineers sleeping in the factories of Chinese suppliers, just teaching them how to do effective business. And of course, you had Apple giving away everything when they built data centers. This story is actually really interesting because the reason this data center was built in Guiyang, anybody want to guess why? Any Chinese politics people know who the governor of Guiyang was at this time? It was Chen Ming'er. And there were some of us predicting that if you want to be in good with the Chinese government, Chen Ming'er is going to be Xi Jinping's successor in 2023. So build data centers for him. Now it turned out we were wrong, but the data centers were built anyway. And we started to see that process. And then amazingly, China re-released the report. And Apple's score was so different. It was sort of funny watching executives be like, how did that score get changed again? I'm like, okay, guys, but the main thing is partnership. Under Xi Jinping, you cannot be effective at doing business today unless you are. Now that means you don't for sure have to have a joint venture relationship, but you have to show up showing that you are delivered for China. Now, the thing that's really interesting about 10 years after Huawei phones were put off limits for government officials in the US, Apple phones are put off limits and Apple stock takes a $200 billion down. My feeling is that this is really a stepping out moment. This is the stepping out party because companies, my colleagues and I have written about this, but companies like Apple and Tesla are married. They are married to China. They are not going anywhere. And so, yeah, we can have, no longer government officials can use iPhones, but Apple is stuck. They are there to stay. And the Chinese government now knows it. And they're flexing a little bit of muscle and saying, we got our own chips, by the way. Now, there's a lot of debate about whether Intel's chip is actually can be mass produced and et cetera, et cetera. But the fact that that was announced while Raimondo was there was kind of amazing. And then the fact that this announcement followed directly on its heels was pretty amazing. And so I think we're really seeing a fascinating moment in which there's so much both intellectual, but also just, mind-blowing stuff happening that I think really kind of gives a lot of us who care about China and care about China's role in the world and care about, where this global geopolitical economy is going. It's a great, it's scary, but it's a great moment. It's a great moment for Asia Study Centers. So I'm gonna, sorry, we still have about 15 minutes, but Julianne said, even since there's a reception afterward, if we go a little late with our Q&A,
Yes.
that's okay. Okay, thank you. So sorry to talk fast and sorry to take up 45 minutes, but please, your thoughts. Yes, please.
So one thing, I sort of try to look at the China thing and then the Japan thing that happened in the 70s, where the Japanese were actually doing a good job of sort of taking over the world economically and technologically, and then it sort of fell apart for other reasons. But the one thing the Japanese were not trying to do is take the world on militarily, which is what China is also trying to do. So how do we balance on the one hand, the PLA and China's desire to be economically, which is done very well, but then we have all these incidents. I'm surprised they haven't really blown up, where they're really getting in the way of US and Australian reconnaissance planes, and they're gonna, or one of those things is gonna come down.
So. Yes, it's a great question, very sensitive question. I'll do my best at answering it. And I'm gonna punt a tiny bit because I'm very knowledgeable about economic development and things like that. I don't consider myself an expert on military issues, but these two things are intertwined, and I get calls a lot from executives who are like, should we pull out of China because there's gonna be a war with Taiwan or war over Taiwan? My guess is that there's not. Now, just to be clear with everybody and anybody who knows this history and knows China well, there is a red line. Like Taiwan declares independence, you know, all bets are off. My sense of what's going on in Taiwan is that, you know, there is a lot cooler heads that are not being very public in Taiwan right now. And everybody knows, like the interesting thing I think about the last couple of years was that Hong Kong was the test case. You know, you rip up a 50-year agreement and see what the world does. What did the world do? Nothing, right? And I'm pretty sure that China knows, and I think this is true too. If China annexed Taiwan, the world would do nothing. And, you know, I'm not a military expert, but I spend a lot of time thinking about economic development and had a lot of inside peeks into what Tim Cook's influence in Washington is. You know, the problem is not that we don't believe in, you know, Taiwan's ability to think through their own future. The problem is that the world is too economically integrated and too dependent on Taiwan. And, you know, this actually is a great point, because this last couple of days is the shot across the bow. Like, you really think Apple's fine? Okay. Like, let me tell you, like, we could shut Apple down. And they could. And so my feeling is that the world, you know, I'm not privy to the conversations that are going on behind the scenes, but I think the world is too clear that, you know, when we have crazy people, like, I don't want to get into politics or talk about anybody, but you have some people in the political spectrum right now who are talking about war. But I just don't think it's going to happen. And I think cooler heads are prevailing or going to prevail. I do think China is tiptoeing up and testing the waters. Like, how are we? And so again, the comparison with Japan, very different, just because China does believe that they are not only soon to be the largest economy in the world, but they deserve to be treated as a geopolitical power. And it drives them crazy that they are still at the kids' table of the G20, right? The idea that they're not treated as one of the 7 largest, most powerful. I know we got others, but go ahead.
Also, when you were mentioning about rule of law, rule by law, recall that maybe 10 or so years ago, there was a big case with Schneider Electric, where they again sued for patent infringement, and instead of winning, they got hit with a $50 million fine. So
Yeah.
So I mean, can you really do business with China?
Well, and again, that's the thing that's so interesting right now is on this rule of law versus rule by law circumstance. You know, there are so many ways now that the Chinese government, and a lot of this is coming out, that if you are basically doing everything that the government wants, I mean, my team and I just wrote an article on corporate governance in China, and the entire system is dependent on this. So Apple is now viewed as a player who is complying with everything, and they're not getting taxed on a lot of the hidden taxes that come in things like the violation of the labor dispatch law. But they could, and every single one of their suppliers could. And so that's what's interesting. Yeah, please.
Thanks, Doug. That was really good. Really.
I hope so. Is everybody feeling okay?
I don't know.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna come at it from a more political point of view. You know, I'm in the school of futures, so I'm gonna stick my neck out and make a prediction.
Okay.
That we shouldn't be looking for war on the East Coast, we should be looking for war on the Southwest Coast. In other words, I'm gonna say that in the next year, there's gonna be a war between India and China in the Himalayas. And whether I'm right or wrong, the question I really have is, what does a company like Apple or these big American companies like Intel, when a war like this happens, what do they learn or what do they take away in their boardrooms? How do they understand these things? So it doesn't matter who wins, who loses, or the nature of the war, right? I'm just thinking now about the impact that that has on back here in the United States.
Yeah. So tell me your name again.
We used to work together, Itty Abraham.
Oh, my God.
That's all right. You look
I-
different too.
No. I'm sorry, Eddie. Please forgive me. But the thing that I think is, I mean, and you know, this is partly as a business school professor, I feel wonderful that I got my taste of corporate sector and boardrooms and wasn't just a consultant sitting on the outside and like, but it broke my heart and it's the reason I left because all they care about for all their talk about like, you know, making the world a better place, leaving the world better than we found it, they only care about their share prices. That's and the volume of phones that they're moving. And like, so when these questions would come up and I'd be put in front of a room like this with like a lot of powerful people and somebody would ask the question wouldn't be like, what should we do? Or how do we think about this? Or how do we have a plan B? I became known as that annoying guy who always talked about plan B. But they were just like, is it gonna disrupt the supply chain? That's all they wanted to know. They just wanted to know if, you know, a war with India would upset the flow of goods, the flow, and this is why also ultimately why China is so important, is that because it's a big place, right? And you can have an entire manufacturing supply chain of thousands and thousands of suppliers. But if once you start crossing borders and you have to send all of those components to Foxconn in India, then a war does disrupt things, right? And so, you know, a lot of what I saw, you know, the Foxconn in India stuff happened later and Pegatron too. But like there was a lot of, we're developing suppliers in Vietnam. It's wonderful. See, we're diversifying. See, Doug, plan B. I'm like, come on, Matt. You're not. Like this is all hand waving. It's just all for show. You don't care about anything. All you care about is whether or not the production supply chain works in China, and that's it. And so I don't know if that answers your question, Eddie, but like it just feels to me like it's so driven by the bottom line. Yes, please.
Yeah, you mentioned that you still believe that China is going to be the largest economy in the world, even before 2035. And I'm just curious, where do you think that growth is going to come from based on the fact that for decades now, China's been goosing GDP with investment spending? That's traditionally how they stimulate the economy when it is in trouble, as it is now. The returns, of course, from investment spending decline over time. The shift to domestic demand-driven growth seems to be slowing, particularly because of leadership's suspicion about creating a consumerist economy. And it also appears that Xi Jinping has national security above everything else. So
Right.
Could you just talk a little bit about how you expect China is going to continue to grow, if not at double-digit rates, the rate it would need to grow to overtake the US?
Yeah, it sounds like we need to talk more because I want to hear more about what your views on that are. And so yes, I don't at all mean to make light of that it's a simple story but the reason that I think it's a powerful story is that as we kind of pull back the veil on things like the errant investment in real estate and, you know, the things that have been messy, right? Which we've had in our own country, by the way, as well. And, you know, like there's a number of economic tensions around the world. But the thing that gives my team and I confidence is just this basic notion that for 40 years, China has been building the most sophisticated manufacturing supply chain in the world. And there is no there's no plan, there's no second substitute for that, right? You can talk about India, you can talk about Southeast Asia and Malaysia, you can talk about Vietnam, you can even talk about bringing jobs back to America. But the ways in which that manufacturing supply chain has to be built, and here again, I think we often, and I'm not accusing anyone in this room, but I just have this feeling when I'm talking to groups that are less well-informed, you know, people think about like, wow, you know, it's just hundreds of millions of cheap laborers, right? Like it's very simple, like that could be lost very quickly. It's not. Like if you spend your time at, I mean, my favorite story about this is just, and this is a bit of a tangent, but you know, when we talk about companies like Apple, you know, like, well, what's the main innovation of the iPhone, right? Probably you would say touchscreen glass. If Steve Jobs was here, that was what he would say, right? Like the ability to do something different than BlackBerry and required glass, not plastic, da da da. Okay, so Apple gave us that, right? No, Apple gave us the idea and Apple engineers came up with the prototype. But the ability to get that done requires mass production. And Zhou Shunfei, who is the richest woman in China and the CEO of Lens Technologies, she gave us that, right? Like that doesn't happen without China. And so that's just a case study, but it's just like, if you look across the manufacturing supply chain, and I continue to love this idea, Andy Walter's idea of local governments as industrial firms. You know, they're a federated system, just like we're a federated system, except they're a federated system that runs like a corporation. You know, if Beijing says, I want 5% growth, and all of the people who are provincial level officials and municipal level officials, their jobs and career advancement depend on whether or not they hit their KPIs. It's just a powerful model. But I want to talk more.
So exports, you mean? So exports are going to drive the growth?
Yes, yeah, for sure. China is going to continue to be the manufacturer for the world, and that's not changing. Yes, and exports will drive that growth. Please.
So as a follow-up to that question, I guess I'll do a few things I don't normally do in a Q&A session. One of which is a little bit long-winded. I'm sorry. So just to introduce myself. So my name is Lucas Klein. I'm an associate professor of Chinese literature here at ASU. So I suppose I represent in some ways like the other path you could have taken, the language and literature sort of career. From the point of view of someone who teaches language and literature, I would really love to see China continue to grow and relations between China and the rest of the world continue to be good. It would be very good for my line of work. As it is, enrollments in Chinese language and also I think in Chinese literature and culture courses are shrinking, at least at the university level, at least in the last few years. I did a study abroad program in Beijing in 1995. That peaked, the enrollment in that peaked in 2008, the year of the Summer Olympics in Beijing, and they closed down in 2020 or 2022, right after the same year as the Winter Olympics. And they did that because there just weren't enough students to run a program, because there weren't enough students in America applying to go to China. This was a decision that was sort of independent of COVID. So there's an issue here that in all of your narrative here, that, you know, I'm learning a lot, but there's a lot that you mentioned that's very instructive to me and is important. But there's one issue that you didn't talk about at all, which is demographics. One of the reasons, based on my understanding, that China was able to grow from the late 70s all the way through until very recently was the one-child policy. Especially in the 80s and the 90s, all these people who had been spending all their time saving money, all these families that were saving their money for their kids' future, for their own future, and so on, they had a whole bunch of expendable income because they only had one kid. And then you have a consumerist economy. And that's why China is buying all sorts of luxury goods around the world. But that's done, right? So not only, and so what you've got now is a demographic collapse in China. And so people who are, I'm 45, right? So people who are just exactly my age, they've got, you know, if they're married, they've got 4 elders to take care of, they've got a number of kids they want, the government wants them to have more kids. I don't see any way that the economy can't contract in terms of its spending power. At the same time, you know, you just said it's not the assembly or the supply chain, it's not simply about lots and lots of cheap labor. It's certainly not simply about it. But cheap labor has definitely been one big part of China's growth, and it seems like that's done, right? Labor can do nothing but get more expensive. So I just don't see how it's all gonna work.
Yeah.
And so Apple may be wedded to China, and Foxconn, which is a Taiwanese company, may get lots of incentives to continue operating in mainland China, but lots of other companies are happy to leave, or at some point when they see that the benefits of the supply chain and the demographic and the mature infrastructure in a place like China, at some point they're going to make a cost benefit analysis and say, you know, we're going to go somewhere else. And I don't see how all of these things don't come together and create a really big crisis in a country that is, as you did, actually you said it's the biggest country in the world population-wise. It's not. It's been passed by India. So I don't see how China can be anywhere near close to surpassing the US in the next handful of years as a growing economy. And if it stays at number 2, I mean, based on my prediction as a, you know, like a literature guy, it's only because the rest of the world's going to be shrinking too. So how would you respond to that?
So first of all, great to meet you. And we have literature brothers, we have to, or literature people, we have to have coffee and talk. And just to be clear, you know, like as academics, and you know, when I was sort of growing up as an academic, you sort of learn the lesson that you can hedge and like look at the statistical significance of this variable, and but like in the public world, people want to know like, what's your prediction, right? So I just say that to say like I could be wrong, like, and you make lots of lots of good points are already being made in this room. Now, let me just tackle a couple of them. I think the demographic issue is fascinating. I don't think it's near the crisis that the outside world thinks it is, at least not yet. There's still 300 million people in the floating population, and that's going to take a ways to run through. Like when, you know, China began the economic reforms, there were 800 million people living in abject poverty, and that lifting of 500 million people out of abject poverty was an amazing story, but there's still 300 million people that are in the floating population that companies like Apple and Foxconn and everybody else rely on. So I don't see that as being that demographically being over yet. Just as an aside on the demographic issue, it was fascinating. I forget what year it was, but it might have been 16, 17 when they reversed the one-child policy. And I was living in China at the time, and it was fascinating to talk to, you know, my Chinese friends who were, because I think the government just didn't predict the idea that, well, you can change policy, but sometimes if you change policy for long enough, it becomes culturally embedded. And so like it became the norm of society to have a family of 3, 1 child. And, you know, and then when you put social media to that and you have the laying down generation, like, you know.
Since you like it and being interrupted, I'll just say it. It's, yes, certainly the cultural habits, but also every single apartment or home in China is 2 bedrooms, right? Every single one, because you got one for the mom and dad, and then one for the 1 child. So if you want to expand the number of kids living there, you've got to have more. You know, you've got to be building other kinds of homes and apartments, and then you get into, you know, the real estate and property crisis that have been happening too. So
No. And again, these are all good points, and I love the debate, and even being told that I'm wrong. And but I guess the point is that, to my mind, like since the economic reforms began in 1979, but for sure since the 90s under Zhu Rongji and Jiang Zemin, the goal has been for China to retake its position as the largest economy in the world. And the reason I think Zhu Rongji is the greatest leader of the economic reforms is that decade under him and Jiang Zemin was just amazing in terms of the sort of institutional changes that were set in place and set in motion, so that when China entered the WTO, you'd see this, you know, this explosion of growth, but you would see it based on an infrastructure that wasn't just about, you know, having a system in which companies can come in and then decide to leave whenever they're going to go somewhere else. And again, my case study is very specific. I know it very well, but Apple ain't going anywhere else. Neither is Tesla, by the way. And so, and you know, there's a bunch of others. Walmart is the single largest exporter from China to the United States. Like when we talk about trade imbalance, let's talk about one company, Walmart, right? And you could argue that, well, Walmart should be able to go elsewhere because it's light industry goods, and that's much easier to move. No, you know, like my experience with Walmart is that they are as stuck as Apple. And so So again, like, there are a lot of different variables that we can push on, and demographics is definitely one of them. And it's definitely, I think the government was just caught flat-footed when they, okay, you can have kids again, and then not only culturally would it be embedded, but infrastructurally, the apartment size. But it looks to me like the demographics are gonna take longer to, it's not just gonna be about China being surpassed by India in terms of population size. Like, it's gonna take a lot longer for the demographic issues to run their, and I think the Chinese government, the officials I know, they're very proud of how innovative they are and how the local governments as industrial firms and people are incentivized to be innovative. The ways in which building of those industrial clusters plays out. So, but it's a complicated topic. Yeah, please, Steve.
Doug, in defense of you, I think you need a little defense.
I'll take it, I'll take it.
So I wanted to ask, I thought it was a juicy subject, and that is the electric car. I think pretty soon in 10 years, we're all gonna be driving Chinese electric cars, which is sort of Apple in reverse. In terms of they're absolutely the leading edge of that internationally, I think. Would you care to make a prediction in that direction, or are you interested in electric cars?
I'm very interested in the topic.
Uh-huh.
And, having half of my life in Michigan, which is where my kids live with their mom, and so I've spent a lot of time there. The Ford deal with CITL is fascinating to me. I mean, it's a big deal, and again, to go back to this question of like, is it just export, or is it the idea that actually there's a lot of know-how that's going on here that, so Elon Musk is interesting because, and I haven't ever hung out with Elon Musk, so I don't know those negotiations from the inside. But, there was a lot of trumpeting over the idea that Elon Musk, the first car company to be allowed to come into China without the joint venture rule exception. So they have a woofie. But I mean, I know enough people who were privy to those negotiations. They made every single promise that Apple was forced to make about basically training the suppliers in how they actually, and again, training them is not just with technology, it's actually with tacit knowledge of how to mass produce things. And so, Tesla needs China because the market's huge, but they need China also because they're learning from China how to mass produce the lithium batteries. And then China is actually, CITL is bringing that stuff back to the big three. So here again, maybe sometime
You're
later.
way ahead on batteries.
Oh my God, it's not even a
hardly good.
competition. Like, they are so far. So yeah. So thank you for the defense question. Thank you. Please.
Well, with that, I want to thank you.
Oh,
And I also would like to invite you and everyone else to join us for our reception. We've got some refreshments, and let's continue the conversation there.
and can I just say one more thing, Julianne?
Please.
I want to thank you all. It is such a gift to get to talk about China, but to get to talk about China with colleagues that I'm a part of the same university with. And so thank you. Thank you all for coming, and thank you.
And we get together and talk. Yeah.